The voicemail came through just after 9, when my apartment had settled into that quiet that makes every sound feel deliberate. My mother did not say my name. She did not ask if I was coming home. Her voice was flat and practiced, the kind she used when she wanted authority to sound like inevitability. Christmas was off. I should expect a call from her lawyer. That was all. No warmth. No explanation. No hesitation. The message ended, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. I stood there in the kitchen with my phone in my hand, noticing how calm my breathing was, how my pulse stayed steady. I did not argue. I did not cry. I typed one word and sent it back. Understood. What my mother believed in that moment was that she had just closed a door on me. What she did not know was that she had finally shown me exactly where I stood, and that clarity had a way of changing everything. I set the phone face down on the counter and leaned back against the sink. The refrigerator hummed, the clock over the stove ticked, ordinary sounds that reminded me I was still in my own life. Outside my window, the streetlights glowed through a thin mist, and somewhere down the block, a neighbor laughed, the sound carrying in short bursts. Christmas had always been my mother's favorite lever. She used it the way some people used silence or money. When she wanted compliance, she wrapped it in tradition. When she wanted control, she framed it as family. Tonight she had stripped it down to something colder, something legal. That difference mattered. I did not replay the voicemail. I did not need to. I had heard that tone before, just never aimed so directly at me. It was the tone she used with school administrators when she wanted an exception, with contractors when she wanted a discount, with relatives when she wanted them to fall in line. It was authority delivered without apology. The lawyer part was meant to scare me. It used to. Years ago, the idea of legal trouble would have sent me scrambling to fix whatever she claimed was broken. Tonight, it landed differently. It sounded like a miscalculation. I rinsed my glass and set it in the rack, then washed my hands and dried them slowly, as if giving myself time to notice what I was feeling. There was no surge of panic, no urge to call her back and ask what I had done wrong. What I felt instead was a familiar recognition, the quiet click of a pattern lining up. My mother did not threaten unless she thought she was losing something, and she did not involve lawyers unless she believed she still had the upper hand. I carried my phone into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch. The cushions were worn in the places I always sat. My coffee table stacked with mail I had not opened yet. My lamp casting a soft circle of light. This was my space, paid for by my own work, built around my own routines. I was not a child waiting to be summoned home. I was a grown woman who had spent years smoothing over messes that were not mine. I thought about the holidays we had shared, the ones where I arrived early to help cook and left late after cleaning, the ones where my presence was assumed, but my opinions were not. I thought about the last few years in particular, how the requests had grown heavier while the gratitude grew thinner. It had always been presented as temporary, just until things settled, just until the next hurdle passed. Somehow the hurdles never ended. Somehow my role stayed the same. My phone buzzed once, then went quiet again. I did not flip it over. If my mother sent another message, it could wait. For once, everything could wait. I stood and walked to my desk, the one place in my apartment that still felt slightly guarded, as if it knew it held things I had not been ready to face. I woke my laptop and entered a password I had not typed in a long time. The screen brightened and a familiar login page appeared, asking for verification. My name sat there in clean lines, connected to structures my family preferred to pretend I did not understand. As the page loaded, a memory surfaced uninvited. My mother at my kitchen table years earlier, her hands wrapped around a mug she did not drink from, explaining how complicated everything was, how she needed me to help just for now. My father sitting beside her, quiet as always, letting her do the talking. The words had been careful, the tone had been warm. It had felt like inclusion. Looking back, I could see how neatly responsibility had been handed to me without ever being acknowledged as such. The screen refreshed and the dashboard appeared. Numbers, dates, documents, all laid out without emotion. I scrolled slowly, reading line by line, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be precise. Precision was the opposite of panic. Precision was how you kept your footing when the ground shifted. I did not click anything yet. I just took it in, reminding myself of what was connected to what, who relied on which pieces staying exactly as they were. Another vibration came from the phone on the couch. This time I glanced at it. A missed call from my mother. No voicemail. I set it back down and returned my attention to the screen. The silence between us felt different now. It was no longer a space filled with obligation. It was a pause I controlled. I thought about the way my mother framed loyalty, how she spoke about family as though it were a contract that only ran in one direction. I had spent years honoring that unspoken agreement, showing up, paying in, absorbing the stress so others did not have to. I told myself it was what good daughters did. I told myself it would even out eventually. It never did. What changed tonight was not her behavior. It was my willingness to keep translating it into something kinder than it was. The legal threat circled back in my mind, not as a fear, but as a question. What exactly did she think she could force? What did she believe I would do when pressured? The answer was simple and revealing. She believed I would fold. She believed I would protect the structure at my own expense because I always had. That belief was the real inheritance she expected me to accept. I closed the laptop without making any changes and sat back in my chair. The choice to wait was deliberate. I wanted to be clear-headed when I moved next. Outside, a car passed and its headlights swept across my walls, then disappeared. I checked the time and realized how late it had gotten without me noticing. The night had a way of stretching when decisions hovered unmade. I stood and went to the bedroom, pulling a sweater from the drawer and slipping it on, then returned to the living room. I picked up my phone and scrolled through recent messages, noticing how many threads were filled with requests rather than conversations. It was a small thing, but it landed with weight. When had I become the default solution instead of a person to be asked? I sat back down and opened the laptop again. This time, I clicked into a section I knew my family never looked at, a place where assumptions went unchallenged because no one expected me to examine them. The system prompted me with warnings written in careful language, explaining consequences, outlining responsibilities. I read every line, not with dread, but with attention. This was not about retaliation, it was about accuracy. My phone rang again. I let it ring until it stopped. There would be more calls. I knew that. The pressure would build. It always did when my mother sensed resistance. But tonight I was not resisting. I was observing. There was a difference. And that difference would matter later. I shut the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The quiet no longer felt oppressive. It felt preparatory. Somewhere in my chest, a steadiness took root. The kind that comes when you stop arguing with reality. Christmas could be canceled. Traditions could be weaponized. Lawyers could be mentioned. None of that changed the simple truth settling into place. I had spent years protecting a balance that only worked if I stayed silent. The voicemail had not taken anything from me. It had given me permission to stop pretending. I picked up my phone one last time and set it to silent, then placed it on the table beside me. Tomorrow would bring explanations, accusations, and urgency. Tonight was just a pause, a clean breath before movement. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark, already knowing that when morning came, I would not be stepping back into the role they expected. The next step would be mine, and it would not be rushed. Morning came without urgency, the kind that slips in quietly and makes it harder to pretend something dramatic has happened. I made coffee the way I always did, measured and unhurried, watching steam rise while the city outside my window eased into motion. My phone stayed where I left it, face down on the table, and for the first time in years I did not feel the pull to check it before my first sip. That absence of anticipation startled me more than the voicemail had. It felt like waking up without a weight I had grown used to carrying. I dressed, packed my bag, and stepped out into the hallway, the echo of my footsteps steady against the concrete. The elevator ride down was uneventful, mirrors reflecting a version of me that looked the same but felt subtly different. I was not bracing myself for a message, not rehearsing explanations in my head. I was simply going to work. The normalcy felt almost defiant. By the time I reached my desk, the office had filled with its usual low hum, keyboards tapping, phones ringing, someone laughing too loudly near the break room. I sat, opened my computer, and let routine take over. Emails came in, tasks lined up, and I moved through them with a focus that surprised me. Somewhere between my second meeting and a late morning call, it occurred to me that this was the first day in a long time when I was not waiting for my family to need something. The realization landed softly but stayed. That space gave my thoughts room to wander, and they returned, inevitably, to how my name had become tied to problems that were never supposed to be mine. It had started years earlier, on an afternoon that felt ordinary at the time. My parents had come over with pastries and careful smiles, the kind that suggested they were about to ask for something while insisting it was no big deal. We sat at my kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the surface, crumbs gathering near my plate. My mother spoke first, as she always did. She talked about pressures, about costs rising faster than expected, about how everything would settle soon if they could just get through this stretch. My father nodded along, adding small affirmations without ever fully taking the lead. They framed it as shared responsibility, as trust, as a sign they believed in me. I remember the way they looked at me then, expectant but gentle, as if the answer was already decided. I said yes because saying yes felt natural. It felt like what a good daughter did when her parents asked for help. The details came later, tucked into emails and forms that I skimmed with the confidence of someone who trusted the people asking her to sign. My name joined theirs on documents that carried weight I did not fully calculate. At the time, it felt temporary, a bridge we would cross together and then dismantle once things stabilized. What they called help began as occasional contributions, a payment here, an adjustment there. Each request arrived wrapped in gratitude, my mother thanking me with a warmth that made refusal feel unnecessary. My father would mention how relieved he felt, how much this eased the strain. I told myself it was manageable, that I was fortunate to be in a position to assist. I did not notice the shift at first, how the language changed from asking to assuming. Over time, the requests became more frequent, less explained. A bill had to be covered sooner than expected. A delay needed smoothing over. There was always a reason, always an assurance that this was the last time. I began to recognize the pattern but dismissed it as circumstantial. Families went through cycles, I told myself. This was just ours. The unspoken agreement settled in quietly. I would step in, and they would not have to confront the consequences of their choices. Nothing was written down, nothing explicitly acknowledged. Expectations were enforced through tone, through timing, through the subtle disappointment in my mother's voice when I hesitated. If I asked questions, she grew distant. If I complied, things stayed calm. Peace became the reward for silence. I remember a particular moment that should have given me pause. It was late summer, the heat heavy even indoors, when an urgent call came in while I was at work. My mother spoke quickly, her voice tight, explaining a situation that needed immediate attention. I transferred money between accounts without leaving my desk, heart racing as I did. Later that evening, when I mentioned the stress of the day, she laughed lightly and changed the subject. There was no follow-up, no acknowledgement of the scramble she had set in motion. It was as if my role ended the moment the crisis did. I began to notice how my contributions were invisible in the family narrative. Publicly, I was praised for being responsible, for having my life together. Privately, my reliability was treated as a given. When something went wrong, I was expected to absorb the shock. When things went right, the credit went elsewhere. I told myself it did not matter, that recognition was not why I helped. Still, something in me tightened each time the balance tipped a little further. What kept me from speaking up was not fear, not exactly. It was the belief that my steadiness was holding everything together. I worried that questioning the arrangement would cause a collapse, that stepping back would expose cracks too wide to mend. My parents relied on that belief, whether consciously or not. They knew I valued stability, that I would choose endurance over conflict if given the option. There was a moment, not long before the voicemail, when I almost said no. The request came in casually, as they always did, but something in the timing felt off. I remember staring at my phone, thumb hovering, considering what it would mean to refuse. The image that rose up was not of confrontation, but of disappointment, of the quiet withdrawal that followed whenever I did not meet expectations. I replied yes before the thought could settle. Looking back now, I can see how carefully the dynamic was maintained. Nothing overt enough to provoke rebellion, nothing blatant enough to demand correction. Just enough pressure to keep me in place, just enough gratitude to keep me believing it was temporary. The lawyer threat followed the same pattern, only sharper, more formal. It was the escalation that revealed what had always been there. That morning at work, as emails continued to arrive and meetings filled my calendar, the pieces aligned in a way they never had before. The agreement I had entered into was not mutual. It protected them and constrained me. My silence had been mistaken for consent, my endurance for obligation. I felt a quiet anger rise, not hot or consuming, but clear. On my lunch break, I walked a few blocks to get some air, the sun warm against my face. I passed storefronts and strangers, all of them absorbed in their own lives, and felt an unexpected sense of separation. Whatever was unfolding with my family existed apart from this world, no longer bleeding into every corner of my day. The realization was freeing in a way I had not anticipated. When I returned to my desk, I pulled up records I had avoided looking at closely before. Not because I was afraid of what I would find, but because I had not wanted to disrupt the story I told myself. I did not dig deeply yet. I simply confirmed dates, amounts, patterns that hinted at a larger picture. The clarity did not shock me. It steadied me. By the time I left the office that evening, the city lights flickering on as dusk settled, I felt a resolve taking shape. I was no longer operating on assumptions or goodwill. I was ready to understand the full scope of what my agreement had cost me and what it had shielded them from. As I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, I knew the next phase would require patience and attention. I set my bag down, turned on a lamp, and sat at my desk, prepared to look more closely than I ever had before. I opened my laptop, and the first thing I saw was my own name staring back at me from a folder I had created months ago and never used. I had labeled it family, like that single word could hold everything without spilling. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, then drifted away. Before I pulled apart numbers and dates, my mind went somewhere it always tried to avoid, to the one person in my family who never seemed to feel the same pressure I did. My brother Evan had been the exception for as long as I could remember. Not in the way people say someone is a free spirit or a dreamer, like it is charming. He was the exception in the way rules bent around him without anyone admitting they were bending. When Evan forgot something, it was funny. When I forgot something, it was a concern. When Evan made a mistake, it was a lesson. When I made a mistake, it was a reflection of my character. Nobody ever announced those rules. They just lived inside our house like furniture. Even now, sitting alone in my apartment in Denver with the light of the screen washing over my hands, I could feel that old reflex, the part of me that wanted to soften the thought. To be fair, to say maybe it was never intentional. But the last 24 hours had done something to me. They had cleared fog I did not realize I was walking through. My mother's voicemail, the legal threat, the cold certainty in her voice, it had made something plain. None of this was accidental. It was structured. The strangest part was how long it took me to name it. Favoritism. I had said the word in my head before, but always quietly, like it might become cruel if I spoke it too clearly. In our family, Evan was the one you protected, the one you excused, the one you told yourself would get it together one day. I was the one you leaned on, the one you expected to handle things, the one you relied on to cover whatever needed covering. They called it being mature. They called it being responsible. They never called it what it was: a system. I reached for my phone and flipped it over. No new voicemails. A few missed calls earlier in the day, all from my mother, none from Evan. That did not surprise me. The voicemail had not been meant for him. The lawyer threat was not for him. It was for me, because I was the one who could actually disrupt the flow of resources they depended on. Evan could disappoint them 100 times and it would be absorbed. I could disappoint them once and it became betrayal. I remembered a Thanksgiving a few years back, the year Evan showed up 2 hours late with a store-bought pie still warm in its plastic container. My mother had waved him in with relief like he had rescued the whole day. She took the pie from him, kissed his cheek, and said, "I knew you would make it." Then she looked at me, already in an apron, hands smelling like onions from chopping, and asked why I had not brought the rolls she liked. I had brought them. They were on the counter. She had not noticed. Evan sat on the couch, scrolling his phone while my father watched football with him, two bodies angled toward the screen, relaxed. I moved between the kitchen and the dining table, adjusting place settings, refilling drinks, cleaning little spills as they happened. Nobody asked if I needed help. Nobody offered to take over. It was not malicious. It was worse than that. It was assumed. Later, after dinner, when my mother pulled me aside near the sink, she did not thank me. She asked if I could cover something for them that month. Just a small gap. Nothing major. I remember the way she lowered her voice, as if making it secret made it lighter. I said yes. I always said yes. On nights like that, I used to tell myself Evan was just different, that he had a harder time with responsibility, that he struggled with follow-through, that he needed compassion. I fed myself those stories because they kept the peace. They kept my parents from becoming angry, kept family gatherings from turning sharp. But the cost of peace was always paid by me. The more I covered, the less anyone noticed I was covering at all. The first time I truly saw the pattern, I was in my mid-20s, and Evan was still living at home. My father asked him to contribute to something simple, a utility bill or a car insurance payment. I cannot even remember which, because the details barely mattered. Evan shrugged and said he did not have it, and my mother immediately stepped in, not to insist, but to rescue. She said, "It is fine. You are trying. We will figure it out." Then she turned to me and asked if I could help them, Just this once, until things settled. I looked from her to my father, waiting for him to say something, waiting for someone to recognize how backward it was. My father's eyes were on the newspaper. He did not look up. In that moment, I understood something I did not want to understand. It was not that they could not ask Evan. It was that they did not want to. Asking him meant risking his anger, his withdrawal, his sulking silence. Asking me meant getting a solution. That day lived in my memory like a small bruise, tender but easy to ignore if I did not press on it. I ignored it for years. I became so good at ignoring it that it felt normal. I shut my laptop and stood, pacing across my living room. The floorboards creaked under my steps. Outside, a siren sounded far away, fading quickly. I stopped by the window and looked down at the street, at people walking dogs, carrying grocery bags, living lives that did not revolve around someone else's crisis. I wondered what it would feel like to be treated as a person first, not a backup plan. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered, not because I was ready to talk, but because I needed to hear the shape of the pressure. My mother's voice filled my ear, already tight with complaint. "Marissa," she said finally, "you have to call me back. This is serious." I kept my voice even. "I heard your message." "Good," she said, then softened it immediately, like she had remembered she needed me calm. "I do not know what you think you are doing, but you are hurting your father. You are hurting this family." There it was, the familiar pivot. Not what happened. Not why she threatened me with a lawyer. Not what she wanted. Just the accusation that my response was the harm. I asked one question. "Where is Evan?" There was a pause, small but telling. "He is busy," she said. "He has a lot going on." Of course he does, I thought. Evan always had a lot going on when responsibility came looking for him. I said, "I am busy too." "Marissa, do not do this," she snapped, then caught herself. "Please, just talk to me like an adult." I almost laughed at that, the way she used adulthood as a weapon when it suited her. Evan could be 30 and still treated like a boy who needed softness. I could be younger than him and treated like the only grown-up in the room. I said, "I will talk when I am ready." Then I ended the call before she could pull me into an argument. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. Not from fear, from the effort of doing something new. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then I returned to my desk and reopened my laptop. The folder called Family waited for me. I clicked into it and began creating subfolders, one for requests, one for transfers, one for documents. The act of organizing felt grounding, like stacking bricks. Every file name was a reminder that what I had lived through was real, not just emotional weather. As I worked, memories kept surfacing, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Evan getting a new car when his old one broke down, no questions asked, while I drove the same sedan until it practically begged to be put out of its misery. Evan taking weekend trips with friends, posting pictures with captions about living life, while my weekends disappeared into errands for my parents, picking up supplies, checking on things they claimed they could not handle. Evan missing family dinners and being told, "It is okay, he is busy," while I missed one because of a work obligation and my mother said, "You always choose work over us." I remembered the way my mother talked about loyalty, how she wore it like jewelry, showing it off when it benefited her. She wanted to be seen as a devoted parent, a woman who had sacrificed everything. In that story, Evan was the vulnerable one she protected, and I was the stable one who owed her. The roles were fixed. If I tried to move, she treated it as rebellion. There was a moment, years ago, when I brought it up gently. We were alone in her kitchen, dishes stacked in the sink, the scent of lemon soap in the air. I had said, I feel like I am always the one helping, and sometimes it feels unfair. My mother had looked at me with a face full of patience that felt almost mocking. She said, "Life is not fair, honey. You are the strong one. Evan needs more support. You understand that, right?" I had nodded then, because nodding was easier than fighting. But that sentence had stayed with me. You are the strong one. It sounded like a compliment, but it functioned like a chain. It meant I would be expected to endure, to absorb, to adjust. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment, I replayed it and felt something colder settle in. Strength was not supposed to mean exploitation. Being capable did not mean being disposable. And if my mother wanted to talk about fairness, then we should talk about fairness all the way through. I checked my phone again and saw a new message from Evan. Just a single line, like he had tossed it off without thought. "Heard Mom is upset? What did you do?" I stared at the screen. The casualness of it almost hurt more than anything else. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What is going on?" Just, "What did you do?" As if the only possible explanation was that I had caused trouble. I typed back slowly. "I did what I had to do." He responded quickly. "You are being dramatic. You always do this around the holidays." I felt my jaw tighten. The holidays. Of course. In his mind, I was not a person reacting to years of pressure. I was a mood, a seasonal inconvenience. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to unload everything, to list every time I had covered for him, every time I had fixed something he broke, every time I had stayed quiet so he could stay comfortable. But I knew how that conversation would go. Evan would deny, deflect, joke, or get angry. He would call me sensitive. He would say I kept score. And my parents would rush in to protect him, because that was the system. So I did something else. I typed, "This is not about Christmas, and it is not about you." Then I left it at that. I set my phone down and returned to the work in front of me. The more I organized, the clearer my role became. I was not just the responsible one. I was the financial shock absorber, the one who made consequences disappear. Evan was the one allowed to stay light, to float above the mess, to be liked without being useful. And my parents were the ones who maintained the arrangement because it kept their world intact. My stomach tightened with a feeling I did not want to name. Betrayal was too dramatic a word, I used to think. Betrayal belonged to affairs and stolen inheritances and courtroom scenes. But sitting there, looking at years of patterns and the immediate response to my mother's threat, I understood betrayal could be quieter. It could be a family choosing convenience over fairness, over and over, until you stopped existing as anything but a resource. I kept working until the sky outside my window turned fully dark. The screen glowed, my eyes tired, my shoulders tense. I saved the folder, backed it up, then closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. The room was silent again, but not the same silence as the night before. This one felt like a pause before movement, like standing at the edge of something you could no longer pretend was not there. Evan's message sat unanswered on my phone. My mother's missed calls waited like they always had, expecting me to give in. For once, I did not feel pulled toward them. I felt pulled toward the truth, toward the numbers, toward whatever I had not been allowed to see. I stood, stretched my arms, and walked to the kitchen to refill my water glass. As I drank, I thought about the next step. Not confrontation, not revenge, not yet. The next step was understanding, fully, exactly, what my family had built around my silence. I turned off the kitchen light and returned to my desk, opened my laptop again, and clicked into the first statement I had been avoiding. The cursor blinked on the screen like a steady heartbeat, and I knew I was done pretending that the way things had always been was the way they had to stay. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, patient in a way I had never allowed myself to be. I took a breath and clicked open the first statement, telling myself I was not looking for proof of wrongdoing, only clarity. That distinction mattered. I had spent too many years explaining things away to start this with an accusation already formed. What I wanted was to see what was actually there, without the stories layered over it. The numbers appeared clean and orderly, rows of dates and amounts that meant nothing until you slowed down long enough to read them as a whole. At first, everything looked familiar. Payments I recognized, transfers I remembered making after late-night calls or tense conversations. I scrolled slowly, line by line, letting my eyes adjust to the rhythm. It felt strangely calming, like organizing a closet you had avoided for years. Then I noticed the first inconsistency. It was small, easy to miss if you were not looking for patterns. A transfer that did not line up with any emergency I could recall, an amount that did not match the explanation I had been given at the time. I paused, my fingers hovering over the trackpad, and scrolled back up to double-check. The date sat there quietly, indifferent to my growing unease. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, searching my memory. Had there been a storm that week? A repair? A medical bill? Nothing surfaced. I opened my eyes and kept going, telling myself one anomaly did not mean anything. Everyone misremembers. Everyone forgets. A few pages later, another one appeared. Different amount. Similar timing. Close enough to a request I remembered, but not quite aligned. I felt my shoulders tighten as the space between coincidence and pattern began to narrow. I was careful not to rush. I had learned that rushing was how you talked yourself out of uncomfortable truths. I stood and walked to the kitchen, poured myself another glass of water, then returned to my desk. Outside, the city hummed with evening life, cars passing, a couple laughing somewhere below. Inside, the only sound was the faint whir of my laptop fan. I sat down again and opened a new tab, pulling up the next set of records, this time cross-referencing dates. The more I compared, the more the story shifted. Requests for help clustered around the same periods as withdrawals or payments I had never been told about. Each time I had stepped in, something else had been moving in the background. It was not dramatic spending, not the kind of thing that screamed excess. That almost made it worse. It was careful, deliberate, the kind of activity that assumed no one was watching closely. I felt a dull heaviness settle in my chest, not sharp enough to be anger, not loud enough to be disbelief. It was recognition. This was why my mother had always sounded so confident when she asked. This was why there had never been panic in her voice, only urgency. She had known exactly where the money was going. She had known I would not look. I scrolled further and froze when I saw it. An account I did not recognize, linked indirectly, its name abbreviated in a way that felt intentionally vague. It was not listed as theirs outright, but it was connected closely enough to raise questions. I clicked into it, half expecting a notification telling me I did not have access. Instead, the page loaded without resistance. The balance was not extravagant, but it was steady, consistent, enough to contradict every conversation about barely holding on. My mouth went dry as I stared at the screen, reading and rereading the same figures as if they might change. They did not. The realization landed quietly, without drama. There was money. Not hidden in a mattress, not stashed overseas, just managed separately, protected from scrutiny. I pushed back from the desk and stood, pacing the length of my living room. My heart beat a little faster now, not with fear, but with the effort of staying composed. I thought about every time my mother had said things were tight, every time she had sighed heavily before asking me to help. I thought about my father's silence, the way he always let her lead those conversations. I thought about Evan, living his life unbothered, trusting that someone else would handle the consequences. I returned to the desk and clicked through the account's history. Dates lined up with trips my parents had mentioned casually, with upgrades they had brushed off as necessary. Nothing illegal, nothing flashy. Just enough comfort preserved at my expense. The pattern was unmistakable now. I had not been helping them survive. I had been helping them avoid discomfort. A memory surfaced, uninvited. My mother on the phone, her voice strained, telling me insurance had gone up again, that she did not know how they would manage. I had transferred money while standing in line at a grocery store, the hum of refrigerators around me, feeling the familiar mix of guilt and relief. Relief that I could fix it. Guilt that I had not offered sooner. The ease with which I had accepted responsibility made my stomach turn now. I realized then why they never expected me to check. They had built a version of me that suited their needs. Reliable, yes. Capable, yes. But emotional, reactive, too trusting to verify. They spoke to me as if I were driven by feeling alone, as if logic belonged to them. That underestimation had protected them for years. I opened a folder on my desktop and began saving copies, naming each file carefully, methodically. The act felt almost clinical, like documenting evidence in a case that had been unfolding without my consent. As I worked, my phone buzzed again. I ignored it. Whoever was calling could wait. This mattered more. Hours passed without me noticing. The water in my glass went untouched. My eyes ached from staring at the screen, but I kept going, following the trail patiently. I was not looking for a smoking gun. I was building a picture, piece by piece, of how my support had allowed others to live without confronting their choices. At one point, I stopped and pressed my fingers to my temples, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of sadness. Not for the money, not even for the deception, but for how easily my trust had been used. I had believed we were in this together. I had believed my role mattered beyond what I provided. Seeing the truth stripped of its justifications felt like losing something intangible, something I had not known I was still hoping for. I let the feeling wash through me, then fade. This was not the moment for collapse. It was the moment for understanding. I straightened in my chair and returned to the work, determined not to look away again. By the time I finished organizing the files, the night outside my window had deepened, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I saved everything twice, then backed it up to a drive I kept tucked in a drawer. When I finally closed the laptop, the silence that followed felt different from before. It was heavier, yes, but also clearer. I sat there for a long moment, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly. The truth had not arrived with a crash. It had settled in like dust, coating everything evenly, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. My family's story, the one I had carried for them, no longer held together. And I understood now why my mother had reached for a lawyer so quickly. She was not afraid of me being hurt. She was afraid of me seeing clearly. I stood and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness. Tomorrow, there would be more calls, more pressure, more attempts to redirect me back into my role. But something had shifted tonight that could not be undone. I had followed the trail they never meant for me to follow, and it had led me somewhere I could not unsee. I went to bed with my phone on silent, the weight of what I had learned pressing gently but firmly against my thoughts. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it carried with it a sense of resolve I had never felt before. The next step would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate, informed, and entirely my own. Morning light filtered through the blinds in thin stripes, landing across the floor like quiet reminders that time was still moving forward. I sat at the edge of my bed longer than usual, listening to the city wake up, letting the weight of the night before settle into something I could carry. The discoveries from my records did not feel raw anymore. They felt confirmed, solid in a way that no amount of denial could soften. What surprised me was not the money itself, but how easily it explained everything else, especially the holidays. Christmas in my family had always been treated like a sacred season, a test of loyalty disguised as celebration. My mother spoke about it with reverence, as if tradition itself were fragile and needed protecting from dissent. The tree had to go up at a certain time. The meals had to follow a familiar order. Everyone had to show up, no matter what else was happening in their lives. It was framed as togetherness, but underneath it was something more rigid. Christmas was not optional, it was proof. I remembered the way my stomach used to tighten every December, how I planned my schedule around the expectation that I would be needed. There was always an unspoken list waiting for me, errands to run, food to prepare, loose ends to tie up so everything looked seamless. I told myself I loved it. I told myself the stress meant it mattered. Only now did I see how carefully that belief had been cultivated. The first time I was quietly left out, I convinced myself it was an accident. It was a smaller holiday, not Christmas, just a weekend gathering that I heard about after the fact. My mother had mentioned it casually, as if she were talking about the weather, saying plans had come together last minute and she did not want to bother me. I smiled and nodded, telling her it was fine, that I had been busy anyway. Inside, something had shifted, a subtle question forming without words. That pattern repeated itself over the years, small exclusions explained away with convenience and timing. Each time, I accepted the explanation because challenging it felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. I did not want to be the person who made things awkward. I did not want to be the one who questioned family intentions. It was easier to believe there was no intention at all. But the more I looked back, the clearer it became that nothing had been as spontaneous as it was presented. Trips required planning. Gatherings required coordination. Decisions were made in rooms I was not invited into, then delivered to me as facts. I was not being forgotten. I was being managed. A memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. A Christmas a few years ago when I arrived early, arms full of bags, breath fogging in the cold air. The house had already been warm with activity, music playing, the smell of food heavy and sweet. I moved through the kitchen instinctively, setting things down, washing my hands, taking over where I always did. My mother thanked me without looking up, already moving on to the next task. Later that afternoon, I learned Evan had decided to spend the morning with friends instead. Nobody had been upset. Nobody had called to ask where he was. They saved his favorite dish for when he eventually arrived. That was the holiday that changed something in me, though I did not know it at the time. I remember standing by the counter, watching my family laugh around the table, feeling oddly transparent. I was there, doing everything I was expected to do, yet somehow separate from the joy I was helping create. When Evan finally showed up, cheeks flushed from the cold, he was greeted with relief and affection, as if his presence alone completed the picture. My presence had never been optional enough to feel special. I carried that feeling quietly, tucking it away where I stored so many other discomforts. It was not until now, after seeing the financial trail laid bare, that the meaning of those moments settled in. Christmas had never been about inclusion for me. It had been about access. I was included when I was useful. I was excluded when I was not needed to hold something together. The voicemail from my mother did not create this realization. It crystallized it. Hearing her cancel Christmas with such finality, paired with the threat of legal action, stripped away the last illusion I had been holding. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a calculated move. She had already decided how the season would look without me. The call was not an invitation to discuss. It was an announcement. I moved through my day with that understanding humming beneath everything. At work, conversations flowed around me, plans were made, deadlines discussed. I participated, nodded, contributed, all while feeling as though I were observing myself from a slight distance. There was a calmness in that detachment, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer waiting for an invitation that might never come. On my lunch break, I sat alone in a small park near the office, watching leaves skitter across the pavement in the breeze. Families passed by, parents holding hands with children, couples sharing food from paper bags. I thought about the version of family I had been chasing, the one where loyalty was mutual and support flowed both ways. I realized that version had existed mostly in my imagination, sustained by hope and habit. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. I did not open it. I could already predict its contents. Concern layered with accusation. Warmth laced with control. I let it sit, feeling no rush to respond. The power of not reacting surprised me. It felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it for too long. What struck me most was how little anger I felt. There was sadness, yes, and disappointment. But beneath that was clarity. Christmas was not the cause of our conflict. It was the stage on which it played out. The real issue was my role, the way my family had learned to function with me as a constant support beam. Once that beam was questioned, the structure wobbled, and fear rushed in to replace gratitude. I returned home that evening and walked through my apartment slowly, noticing details I often overlooked. The way the light shifted across the walls at sunset, the hum of the heater kicking on, the comfort of a space that belonged entirely to me. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, breathing in the quiet. There was no list waiting for me here, no expectations beyond the ones I set for myself. As night fell, I opened my laptop again, not to dig into records, but to reflect. I pulled up old emails, messages exchanged around past holidays, reading them with new eyes. Phrases jumped out that I had skimmed over before, references to plans already made, decisions already settled. I could see now how often I had been informed rather than consulted. The pattern was unmistakable once you allowed yourself to see it. A sense of resolve settled in as I closed the laptop. I was done waiting for acknowledgement that would never come. I was done measuring my worth by how seamlessly I fit into a story that was not written with me in mind. The absence of an invitation was no longer a wound. It was information. Later, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Evan. He wrote that Mom was upset, that things were getting blown out of proportion, that holidays were stressful for everyone. I stared at the screen, recognizing the familiar minimization. I typed a short reply, then erased it. Whatever I said would be filtered through the same lens, reshaped to preserve the roles we all knew too well. I set the phone down and turned off the light, letting darkness fill the room. Lying there, I felt something loosen inside me, a tension I had not known how to name until it was gone. I no longer needed Christmas to validate my place in the family. I no longer needed their approval to act in my own interest. The realization was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet and steady, like a door closing gently but firmly. As sleep edged closer, I understood that the next steps would not be about confrontation or explanation. They would be about alignment, about making choices that matched the truth I had finally allowed myself to see. Christmas had been the excuse my mother used to assert control. Losing it, I realized, might be the first gift I had been given in years. The quiet that followed that realization stayed with me into the next day, not heavy but focused, like a held breath. I went about my routine with an unusual steadiness, making breakfast, answering emails, folding laundry that had been sitting in a basket too long. Ordinary tasks grounded me as my thoughts organized themselves around one clear truth. My family had always underestimated me, And that misunderstanding had protected them far more than it had ever protected me. They thought of me as dependable, the one who showed up without being asked, the one who absorbed stress so others did not have to. In their minds, dependability was not the same as agency. It meant I would comply, not calculate. It meant I would feel my way through decisions, not map them out. That assumption was the blind spot I had lived inside for years, without realizing how much room it gave me. I had never been careless with information, even when I appeared open. There were things I kept quiet because they felt like mine to manage, not because I was hiding anything, but because I understood how quickly knowledge could be turned into leverage in my family. My mother had a way of collecting details and deploying them when it suited her. I learned early that not everything needed to be shared to be real. There had been moments over the years when I chose silence deliberately, though I never named it that way at the time. A document I did not mention. A permission I did not explain. An option I noted but did not discuss. Each choice felt small on its own, insignificant compared to the constant demands around me. Looking back now, I could see how those choices added up, forming a quiet reserve of control my family never thought to look for. The structure they relied on was built on habit, not understanding. Roles were assumed, not reviewed. My parents trusted the system because it had always worked for them. They did not question how it functioned on paper because it functioned in practice. I was the one who made sure it did. They never stopped to consider what would happen if I stepped back, because the idea did not fit their image of me. Once I allowed myself to think through the mechanics, the fragility of their position became clear. There were processes that depended on my continued participation, approvals that required my consent, timelines that moved forward only because I kept them moving. None of it was dramatic. None of it involved secret buttons or hidden traps. It was ordinary, bureaucratic, and entirely legal. That was what made it powerful. I sat at my desk one afternoon with a notebook open, writing down what I knew, not as a plan for revenge, but as a map. If I withdrew cooperation, certain reviews would be triggered. Questions would be asked that had been deferred for years. Responsibilities would snap back to the people who had avoided them. There would be no explosion at first, just a slow, unavoidable shift. The seriousness of that shift settled over me as I wrote. This was not something I could do halfway. Once set in motion, it would not pause for family meetings or emotional appeals. Institutions did not care about tradition or guilt. They cared about documentation and compliance. For the first time, I saw a path that did not require me to argue my worth. It simply required me to stop buffering theirs. I closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. A part of me felt a familiar tug, the instinct to protect, to soften what I knew would be painful. That instinct had kept me in place for years. It was rooted in loyalty, yes, but also in fear. Fear of being labeled selfish. Fear of being the reason everything fell apart. My family had relied on that fear as much as they relied on my money. The voicemail from my mother replayed in my mind, not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them. She had reached for a lawyer not because she wanted resolution, but because she believed it would bring me back into line. Legal language had always intimidated me. She knew that. What she had not accounted for was how much time I had spent understanding the framework she assumed I was too emotional to grasp. That realization stripped away my last reason to wait. As long as the conflict stayed emotional, I could justify restraint. I could tell myself things would calm down. That reason would return. The moment she formalized it, she moved the fight into territory where clarity mattered more than feelings. In doing so, she gave me permission to protect myself fully. I spent the evening thinking through timing, not rushing, not hesitating. The act itself would take minutes. The consequences would take much longer. I needed to be ready for that gap, for the silence that would follow before panic set in. I needed to be prepared not to intervene when the first signs of strain appeared. That night, my phone buzzed with another message from my mother. I read it this time, scanning quickly. It was a mix of concern and command, urging me to call her back, warning me not to make things worse. I did not respond. Instead, I turned the phone off and placed it in a drawer. The quiet that followed felt intentional, like closing a door you had held open too long. In the days that followed, I moved through my life with a new awareness. Conversations at work felt sharper, decisions felt cleaner. I noticed how often I anticipated needs that were not voiced, how deeply ingrained that habit was. Each time I caught myself doing it, I paused and asked whether it was truly necessary. Sometimes it was, often it was not. I thought about the times I had almost used this leverage before, the moments when frustration flared and then cooled. Each time I had pulled back, choosing stability over fairness. I told myself I was being patient, generous, mature. What I had really been was convenient. That distinction mattered now. The risk they had never calculated was not that I would get angry. It was that I would get clear. Anger could be negotiated with apologies and promises. Clarity could not. Once you saw the shape of a system, you could not pretend it was accidental anymore. You either participated or you did not. I stood at my kitchen counter one evening, chopping vegetables for dinner, the steady rhythm of the knife calming my thoughts. I realized that what I was planning did not feel like punishment. It felt like withdrawal. I was not taking anything from them. I was returning responsibility to where it belonged. That understanding steadied me when doubt crept in. I would miss the illusion of harmony. I would miss the version of my family that existed when I made everything easier. But that version had cost me too much. The leverage I held was not a weapon. It was a boundary I had never enforced. By the end of the week, the decision had crystallized. I knew exactly when I would act. Not because I was waiting for courage, but because timing mattered. I wanted the action to land quietly, without spectacle, without warning. Surprise was not cruelty. It was protection. On the morning I chose, I woke early, before the city stirred, and sat with a cup of coffee at my desk. The screen glowed softly in the dim light, familiar and unthreatening. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel afraid. I felt resolved. Before I opened anything, I paused, letting myself acknowledge the weight of what was about to change. This was the line I had never crossed. Once crossed, there would be no pretending we could go back. I exhaled slowly, then reached for the mouse. The silence in the room felt dense, expectant. Whatever came next would come without my explanation or approval. I understood that now, and I was ready to let it happen. The morning felt strangely ordinary, almost gentle, as if the day itself did not know what I was about to do. I woke before my alarm and lay still for a moment, listening to the low hum of the building, the distant rush of traffic beginning to thicken outside. There was no knot in my stomach, no rush of adrenaline. What I felt was calm, the kind that settles in after a decision has already been made. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately. Coffee brewed, toast browned, the radio murmured in the background. I noticed small things, the way the mug warmed my hands, the light shifting across the countertop. It struck me how many times I had rushed through mornings like this, distracted by someone else's urgency, already bracing for a call or a message that would redirect my day. Today, there was nothing to brace for. Today belonged to me. I did not warn anyone. The thought crossed my mind briefly, the old instinct flaring, the reflex to soften the blow before it landed. But I pushed it aside. Every warning I had ever given my family had been used against me. It became an opening for guilt, for pressure, for promises that dissolved as soon as the immediate threat passed. Silence was not avoidance this time. It was strategy. At my desk, the familiar glow of my laptop felt almost comforting. I logged in and navigated through screens I had visited so many times before, my fingers moving without hesitation. The process itself was not dramatic. There were no flashing alerts, no ominous sounds, just checkboxes, confirmations, lines of text explaining what would happen next. I read each one carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be fully present for the choice I was making. There was a warning about reassessment, about how changes could trigger reviews and consequences for other parties involved. I did not skim it. I let the words register. For years, I had absorbed consequences so others would not have to. This time, I was allowing them to land where they belonged. I paused with my cursor hovering over the final confirmation. In that pause, memories pressed in, uninvited. My mother's voice telling me how much she relied on me. My father's quiet nods of approval when I stepped in. Evan's easy smile as he moved through life unburdened. The image of all of them, comfortable in a structure that required my constant support, flickered and then faded. I clicked submit. The screen refreshed and a simple confirmation appeared, unemotional and final. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of triumph. What I felt instead was a subtle release, like loosening a grip I had not realized was so tight. I closed the laptop and sat back, hands resting in my lap, breathing evenly. Nothing happened right away. The room stayed quiet, the world unchanged. That was expected. The systems I had set in motion moved on their own timelines. There would be no immediate phone call, no instant reaction. I stood and walked to the window, watching people pass below, carrying bags, talking on phones, living lives untouched by my decision. The normalcy grounded me. A part of me wondered if I should feel something more dramatic. Fear, guilt, regret. Instead, there was a steady sense of rightness. This was not revenge. It was withdrawal. I was stepping out of a role I had never agreed to play indefinitely. As the day unfolded, I went to work, attended meetings, answered questions that had nothing to do with my family. I noticed how often my mind tried to jump ahead, to imagine the fallout, the conversations, the accusations. Each time, I brought myself back to the present. Anticipation had kept me trapped for years. I did not need it now. By late afternoon, the first flicker of doubt surfaced. It was faint, but persistent. The voice that asked whether I was being too harsh, whether I could have handled it differently. I recognized that voice immediately. It was the same one that had kept me compliant for so long. I let it speak, then let it go. Doubt did not mean the decision was wrong. It meant the conditioning was strong. I did not check my phone until evening. When I finally picked it up, there were missed calls, but fewer than I expected. Messages that asked me to call back, to explain, to please stop whatever I was doing. None of them acknowledged what I had already endured. None of them asked why it had come to this. They were not reaching out for understanding. They were reaching out for control. I set the phone down again without responding. The instinct to fix, to smooth things over, rose up sharply then. I had to override it consciously, reminding myself that stepping in now would undo everything. I had spent years cushioning my family from consequences. Doing so again would only confirm that I was still available to be leaned on. That night, I cooked dinner for myself. Something simple and comforting. As I ate, I thought about the difference between punishment and accountability. Punishment was reactive, driven by anger, meant to hurt. Accountability was neutral. It allowed cause and effect to meet without interference. What I had done fell squarely in the second category. I washed the dishes and dried them, stacking them neatly in the cabinet. The small order of the task felt reassuring. Afterward, I sat on the couch and let the quiet fill the room. There was no soundtrack of family drama playing in my head, no running commentary of what I should say next. Just silence, honest and unadorned. Sleep came easily that night. When I woke the next morning, the world still looked the same, but I felt different inside it. Lighter, in a way that surprised me. I checked my phone and saw more missed calls, more messages, the tone shifting subtly from confusion to urgency. I did not respond. I went about my day, aware that the process I had initiated was beginning to touch edges they had long ignored. By the second day, the silence from my side had clearly unsettled them. Calls came closer together. Messages grew shorter, sharper. Somewhere in that escalation, I felt a flicker of sadness for the family I wished I had, the one that could have faced this honestly, that could have acknowledged the imbalance and worked to correct it. That family existed only in theory. The one I had was reacting exactly as I had expected. In the late afternoon, an unfamiliar number appeared on my screen. I did not answer it. A voicemail followed, professional and carefully worded, introducing itself as representing my parents' interests and urging me to make contact to resolve a situation. The phrasing was neutral, but the urgency underneath it was unmistakable. They had escalated, just as my mother had promised. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. The involvement of a lawyer did not scare me anymore. It confirmed what I already knew. The pressure was increasing because the consequences were real. As evening settled in, I sat at my desk and reviewed what I had done, not to second guess, but to remind myself of the facts. Everything was above board. Everything was legal. I had not acted impulsively. I had acted deliberately, after years of shouldering responsibility that was never meant to be mine alone. The phone buzzed again, and this time I recognized Evan's number. I let it ring out. I knew what he would say. He would ask why I was doing this, accuse me of blowing things out of proportion, urge me to think about the family. He would not ask how it felt to be the one always expected to fix things. He never had. I stood and stretched, my muscles tight from hours at the desk. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with fading color. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed, the sound carrying briefly before disappearing. Life went on, indifferent to my family's turmoil. I turned off my phone and placed it in a drawer, just as I had before. The act felt symbolic, a clear boundary between what I could control and what I could not. Whatever came next would come without my intervention. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. There was no dramatic change, no visible transformation. Just a woman who had finally stepped out from under a weight she had been carrying too long. I turned off the light and lay down, feeling the quiet settle around me once more. I knew the calls would keep coming. I knew the pressure would intensify before it broke, but for the first time, I was not responsible for managing that storm. I had taken my hand off the support, and whatever shifted next would have to shift without me. The pressure arrived in waves instead of all at once, each one testing whether I would flinch. I woke to a phone that vibrated itself into silence inside the drawer, the muted thrum a reminder that something outside my apartment wanted my attention badly. I did not open it right away. I showered, dressed, ate breakfast, letting routine anchor me while the day gathered itself. When I finally checked, the screen lit up with a cascade of missed calls and messages, some pleading, some curt, some worded carefully enough to sound reasonable. None of them acknowledged why this had happened. All of them assumed I would respond. At work, the unfamiliar number returned, followed by a second voicemail. The tone had shifted from courteous to concerned, still controlled but less patient. I listened to it once through my headphones, then closed the app and returned to a spreadsheet, fingers moving with practiced ease. It struck me how often urgency had been used to override my boundaries, how easily I had been trained to treat other people's timelines as more important than my own. The systems I dealt with daily did not behave that way. They moved when conditions were met, not when someone demanded it. That logic had always made sense to me. I was only now applying it to my own life. By mid-afternoon, the story my family was telling began to leak beyond them. A coworker asked gently whether everything was okay at home, mentioning she had seen something vague online about family stress. I thanked her and said things were being handled. That was true, just not in the way anyone expected. During a break, curiosity got the better of me and I opened my social feed. My mother had posted again, a carefully framed message about heartbreak and betrayal, about doing everything for your children only to be abandoned when it mattered most. She did not name me. She did not have to. The comments poured in beneath it, sympathy stacking like bricks. People I had known my entire life chimed in with words of comfort, offering prayers and advice, praising her strength. Reading them felt surreal, like watching a play where I had been cast as the villain without being given a script. My first instinct was to correct the record, to type out a response that laid everything bare. I could feel the words forming, precise and devastating. I did not post anything. The restraint surprised me. In the past, silence had been my default because I feared escalation. This time, silence was a choice grounded in strategy. Engaging publicly would only validate her stage. I understood now that my mother did not want resolution. She wanted witnesses. The more I resisted the urge to defend myself, the more her narrative revealed its own hollowness to those willing to see it. That evening, Evan finally left a voicemail that cut through the noise. His voice was tight, frustration leaking through attempts at calm. He said Mom was falling apart. He said Dad was barely sleeping. He said I needed to call the lawyer back and make this right before it got worse. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask what had led me here. He spoke as if my role were obvious, as if returning to it would fix everything. I sat on the couch with the phone in my hand, replaying the message once more, listening for anything I had missed. There was nothing new there. It was the same dynamic dressed up as concern. I deleted the voicemail and set the phone aside. The next morning, a letter arrived by email, formal and measured, outlining potential outcomes and requesting my cooperation. It was written to sound neutral, but the subtext was unmistakable. This was meant to scare me back into line. I read it carefully, noting what it said and what it did not. There were no accusations, no claims of wrongdoing, just pressure. I forwarded it to a folder and closed my laptop. By the third day, the consequences I had anticipated began to surface, not dramatically, not yet, but in subtle ways that rippled outward. Appointments were requested, documents were demanded, timelines tightened. Systems that had been insulated by my involvement now required answers. I imagined my parents fielding those questions, scrambling to produce explanations they had never needed before. The thought did not bring me satisfaction. It brought me a sober understanding of how long they had relied on my presence to keep scrutiny at bay. Late that afternoon, my phone rang again, and this time I answered. The voice on the other end introduced himself again, confirming details, asking whether I intended to engage. I listened without interrupting, then responded calmly that all communication should be put in writing. The pause that followed was brief, but telling. He agreed. We ended the call without hostility, without warmth. It was exactly as it should have been. When the line went dead, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Not because I had spoken to a lawyer, but because the formality underscored how far we had drifted. There would be no kitchen table conversations now, No emotional appeals that ended in compromise. The structure had changed. I had changed it. That night, my grandfather called. His number lit up the screen, familiar and steady. I answered immediately. He did not waste time with small talk. He said he had heard things were difficult. He said he did not know all the details, but he knew patterns when he saw them. He told me he trusted my judgment. There was no advice in his voice, no attempt to steer me, just acknowledgement. After we hung up, I sat quietly, letting the weight of his words settle. Validation from him felt different than anything I had received from my parents. It did not demand anything in return. It simply recognized me as capable. I realized then how starved I had been for that kind of regard. The online narrative continued to churn, posts appearing and disappearing, comments shifting tone as inconsistencies crept in. Some people began to ask questions, others reached out privately, tentative, unsure. I did not respond to most of them. This was not a campaign. It was a reckoning that needed no amplification from me. By the end of the week, the frantic calls slowed. Not because things had resolved, but because a new reality was setting in. They were learning, slowly and painfully, what it meant to navigate systems without me smoothing the path. I imagined the confusion, the anger, the sense of betrayal they must have felt. I had felt those things for years. Feeling them now did not make me cruel. It made me finished. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I took a walk through my neighborhood, hands tucked into my coat pockets, breath fogging in the cool air. Leaves crunched beneath my feet. The world felt steady. I thought about how easily I had been painted as heartless for refusing to continue a role that hurt me. I thought about how often women were expected to sacrifice without complaint, to absorb chaos and call it love. As I turned back toward my building, I knew the next phase would require patience. There would be meetings, explanations, attempts to negotiate. The storm was not over, but the eye of it had shifted away from me. I had stepped out of the center, and that alone changed everything. Inside my apartment, I set my phone on the table and sat beside it, not to check it, but to acknowledge its presence without letting it dictate my actions. Whatever message came next could wait. I had learned something essential about power in the past few days. It did not announce itself loudly. It moved quietly, decisively, and left others scrambling to catch up. As evening settled in, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the lights flicker on across the city. Somewhere, my family was still trying to pull me back into alignment. Somewhere, plans were being revised, assumptions dismantled. I felt the pause stretch, not empty, but full of possibility. I knew the next conversation would change things further. I was ready for it. Not with rehearsed lines or defensive arguments, but with the simple clarity that had carried me this far. The waiting no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like strength gathering itself for what came next. The meeting was set for a place that carried no memory for any of us, a neutral diner just off the highway where the coffee was strong and the booths were cracked with age. I chose it deliberately. There would be no childhood photos on the walls, no holidays layered into the air, nothing for my mother to weaponize with nostalgia. It was just a place where people came to eat and leave, and that was exactly what I needed. I arrived early and slid into a booth by the window, my back to the wall, hands folded around a mug I did not plan to finish. The hum of conversation around me felt distant, a low background noise that kept things grounded. I watched cars pull in and out of the parking lot, my breath steady, my thoughts clear. For once, I was not rehearsing what I would say. I already knew. They came in together, my parents first and Evan a step behind, his shoulders tense, his jaw set in a way I recognized as frustration trying to pass for confidence. My mother scanned the room quickly, her eyes landing on me with a flicker of something sharp that disappeared almost instantly. She smiled as she approached, the familiar expression meant to soften whatever came next. My father followed silently, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, eyes avoiding mine until the last possible moment. They slid into the booth across from me, the vinyl squeaking under their weight. For a brief second, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick with everything we had not said over the years. I did not rush to fill it. My mother broke first, her voice carefully controlled. She said she was glad I agreed to meet. She said this had all gotten out of hand. She said families did not handle things like this through strangers and systems. Each sentence was delivered with practiced calm, as if tone alone could restore the old order. I listened without interrupting, nodding once when she paused, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. When she finished, she waited, her gaze steady, expectant. This was the moment she believed she could still pull me back. I told her I had not agreed to meet to argue. I told her I was there to be clear. The words came out even and measured, surprising me with their steadiness. I said I would not be discussing my decision or reversing it. I said what had been set in motion would continue. The diner seemed to grow quieter around us, though I knew that was just my focus narrowing. Evan leaned forward then, his voice rising despite himself. He asked what I thought I was doing. He said I was tearing the family apart over money. He said I was punishing everyone because I felt left out. The accusations tumbled out quickly, sharpened by weeks of frustration. I let him finish too. When I responded, I did not match his volume. I told him this was not about punishment. I told him it was about responsibility. I said I had spent years absorbing consequences so none of them had to. I said I was done doing that. The simplicity of it seemed to throw him off more than anger would have. My father cleared his throat, finally speaking. He said he did not understand why I had not come to them first. He said they could have worked something out. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt a sadness I had not expected. I told him I had come to them many times, just not in the way he meant. I told him I had shown up with money, with time, with silence. I told him working something out had always meant me giving more. My mother's composure cracked at that. She accused me of exaggerating. She said I had always offered to help. She said they never forced me. The words were familiar, rehearsed from years of deflection. I felt no urge to argue. Instead, I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of records, timelines, patterns laid out without commentary. I did not narrate them. I did not explain. I let the facts speak. My mother flipped through the pages, her movements slowing as she recognized what she was seeing. My father leaned in, his brow furrowing. Evan went quiet. I told them I was not sharing this to shame them. I told them I was sharing it so there would be no confusion about why I had stepped back. I said I had carried more than my share for a long time, and I would not do it anymore. The air between us felt heavy, not with drama, but with finality. My mother pushed the folder back toward me, her lips pressed tight. She said this was unnecessary. She said families did not keep score. I told her that keeping score was not the same as keeping records. I told her I had not kept score when I paid bills or covered gaps. I had kept records because I was the only one who ever had to. The waitress came by then, asking if anyone wanted anything. We all declined. The interruption felt surreal, a reminder that this confrontation existed in a world that would keep moving regardless of its outcome. Evan spoke again, quieter this time. He asked what I wanted. It was the first question anyone had asked that mattered. I told him I wanted space. I told him I wanted my life back. I told him I wanted to stop being the unspoken solution to problems I did not create. The honesty of it seemed to land harder than any accusation. There was a moment then, brief but unmistakable, when I saw fear flicker across my mother's face. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the structure that had protected her choices. That was when I understood there was nothing left to negotiate. I stood, sliding out of the booth slowly. I told them this was not a goodbye, but it was a boundary. I told them what happened next would happen without my involvement. I wished them well, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a statement of detachment. As I walked toward the door, I felt the weight of their eyes on my back. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as I stepped outside, the cold air sharp against my skin. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, grounding myself in the present. I did not look back. The drive home felt longer than usual, my mind replaying fragments of the conversation without spiraling. I noticed how different it felt to leave without resolving their feelings, without smoothing the edges. The discomfort was theirs to manage now. When I reached my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from my grandfather. He said he hoped the meeting went as it needed to. He said he was proud of me. The simplicity of his words brought a lump to my throat. I typed back a thank you and set the phone aside. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes after something heavy has been set down. In the morning, the world felt quieter, not because things were over, but because the loudest voices no longer lived inside my head. I knew the aftermath would continue to unfold in ways I could not control. There would be consequences, adjustments, perhaps even losses I had not anticipated. But as I stood at my kitchen window watching the city wake up, I felt a calm certainty settle in. Whatever came next, it would be built on truth, not obligation. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed did not explode the way everyone seemed to expect. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment where everything fell apart. Instead, consequences arrived quietly, one document at a time, one unanswered question at a time, the way real life tends to unfold when there is no one left smoothing the edges. I heard about it indirectly at first. A cousin mentioned in passing that my parents were dealing with unexpected reviews. A neighbor asked if everything was okay with the house because there had been people coming by during the day. No one spoke in specifics, but the tone had changed. Where there had once been certainty, there was now confusion. Where there had once been confidence, there was now strain. I did not ask for updates. I did not seek confirmation. The distance I had created required discipline, and I was learning how easy it was to undo progress with curiosity alone. I focused instead on my own routines, grounding myself in what was tangible and present. Work continued. Bills arrived and were paid. Evenings passed quietly. Life did not collapse just because I had stopped carrying someone else's weight. There were moments when guilt tried to resurface, creeping in through old habits. I would be folding laundry or standing in line at the store when the thought would appear uninvited, wondering if I had gone too far, if stepping back had caused more harm than I intended. Each time, I reminded myself of the truth I had documented, the patterns I had lived with for years. Accountability was not cruelty. It was reality. My mother did not contact me directly anymore. Instead, messages filtered through Evan, his tone shifting as the weeks passed. At first, he was angry, accusing me of being cold, of abandoning the family when they needed me most. Later, the anger softened into something closer to panic. He said things were more complicated than they looked. He said Mom was under a lot of stress. He said maybe I could help just this once, just until things settled. I read those messages carefully, recognizing the familiar language of exception and urgency. Just this once had been the foundation of everything that came before. I did not respond. Silence felt unkind at times, but it was the only response that did not reopen the door. One afternoon, a formal notice arrived in my email, confirming changes that were now irreversible. I read it slowly, absorbing the finality of it. This was the moment my family could no longer pretend things would return to normal. The systems they had leaned on had shifted, and no amount of emotion could persuade them otherwise. I closed the message and sat quietly for a long time, letting the weight of it settle. That evening, my grandfather stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in my doorway with his familiar calm, hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes steady. I invited him in, made tea, and we sat at the small kitchen table where so many of my own realizations had taken shape. He did not ask for details. He did not offer advice. He simply said he wanted to see how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I said it was harder than I expected in some ways, easier in others. I said I miss the idea of my family more than the reality of them. He nodded, listening without interruption. When I finished, he said something that stayed with me. He said families often confuse sacrifice with love, and when someone finally refuses to sacrifice anymore, it feels like betrayal to those who benefited. Hearing it framed that way eased something inside me. It did not absolve the pain, but it gave it context. After he left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching his car pull away, feeling grateful for the clarity he brought without demanding anything in return. As winter settled in, the holiday season arrived without ceremony. There were no invitations, no group messages coordinating plans. I spent the days leading up to it quietly, decorating my apartment the way I wanted, cooking meals that comforted me, taking long walks through neighborhoods lit with decorations that felt both festive and distant. Christmas arrived and passed without incident. There was sadness in that, but also relief. I learned later that my family's holiday had been tense, fragmented. Plans had changed last minute. Conversations circled around problems no one wanted to fully name. The absence of a familiar safety net had left everything exposed. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard this. I felt confirmation. The system had been unstable long before I stepped away. My absence had not created the cracks. It had simply revealed them. What surprised me most was how much space opened up in my own life. Without constant demands, I found myself thinking about things I had postponed for years, trips I had wanted to take, courses I had considered. Even simple pleasures like weekends without obligation felt new. I realized how much of my energy had been spent anticipating needs that were not mine to meet. There were still moments of grief, especially when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A song that reminded me of childhood holidays, a recipe I had learned from my mother. Those memories carried both warmth and ache now, inseparable from the context that had reshaped them. I allowed myself to feel that without judgment. Healing did not require erasing the past. It required understanding it honestly. One night, Evan called unexpectedly. I almost did not answer, but something in me felt ready. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. He said things were changing, not just financially, but emotionally. He said Mom was struggling to accept the new reality. He said Dad seemed smaller somehow, less sure of himself. He asked me if I thought things would ever be okay again. I told him the truth. I said I did not know. I said okay, looked different now. I said it depended on whether they were willing to take responsibility instead of searching for someone else to fix things. There was a long pause on the line. He did not argue. When we hung up, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I had not softened my words. I had not rescued him from them. As the new year approached, I reflected on how much had changed in a short span of time. Not just externally, but internally. I no longer measured my worth by how indispensable I was. I no longer mistook endurance for love. The quiet confidence that had begun as resolve had settled into something steadier, something that felt like self-respect. I knew there would still be consequences ahead. Relationships do not reset overnight. Trust, once broken, does not magically reassemble itself. But as I stood in my living room one evening, lights low, city glowing beyond the windows, I felt grounded in a way I never had before. Whatever happened next would unfold without me shrinking to accommodate it. I had stepped out of the role that consumed me, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something essential. The story was not over yet, but the shape of its ending was finally beginning to come into view. Spring arrived without asking permission, sunlight stretching longer across my apartment each evening, revealing corners I had ignored when my life revolved around putting out other people's fires. I noticed the change not because it felt dramatic, but because it felt earned. I was no longer bracing myself for impact. I was standing inside the consequences of my own choice, and they were quieter than I had been taught to expect. The first real shift came in the form of an envelope forwarded to my new address, my name printed neatly on the front. Inside was a notice confirming what had already become obvious through fragments and secondhand comments. The house my parents called the family home was no longer secure in the way it once had been. Terms had changed. Options had narrowed. Nothing illegal, nothing sudden, just the slow tightening that happens when support systems disappear and reality takes their place. I sat at my kitchen table reading it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to acknowledge what it meant. This was the outcome everyone had warned me about, the collapse they said I would cause. And yet, reading those words, I felt no panic, no rush of guilt. Only a sober recognition that this was the result of years of avoidance finally catching up. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as closure. News traveled quickly after that. Relatives who had once stayed silent reached out with cautious messages, asking how I was doing, whether everything was true. Their tone had shifted from judgment to curiosity. I answered some, briefly and honestly, and ignored others. I had learned that not every question deserved my energy. My story was no longer public property, even if it had been discussed that way for years. My mother did not contact me. That absence spoke louder than any accusation she had ever made. It told me she had reached the end of the tactics that worked on me. Without my immediate response, without my willingness to absorb her distress, she had nothing left to leverage. I imagined her telling her version of events to anyone who would listen, the story refined now by consequences she had not anticipated. I did not correct it. Truth had a way of surfacing on its own when people stopped interfering with it. My father called once, unexpectedly, his voice softer than I remembered. He did not apologize. He did not accuse. He simply said things were hard and he hoped I was well. I told him I was. We sat in that silence together for a few seconds before the call ended. It was not reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, and for him, that was a beginning he had avoided for years. Evan's transformation was slower, less predictable. He oscillated between resentment and reflection, sometimes in the same conversation. One afternoon, we met for coffee, the first time we had been alone together since everything unraveled. He looked tired, stripped of the easy confidence that had once protected him. He spoke about responsibilities he had never managed before, decisions he could no longer ignore. He did not thank me. He did not blame me either. He simply said he was starting to understand how much had been hidden from him. Listening to him, I felt a complicated mix of compassion and distance. I could see how the system had failed him too, how favoritism had left him unprepared for independence. But I also knew that understanding did not obligate me to rescue him. I told him I hoped he found his footing. That was all I offered. As my family adjusted to their new reality, I began building one of my own with intention instead of reaction. I took a class I had postponed for years. I traveled alone for the first time without calculating how my absence might inconvenience someone else. I restructured my finances, not out of fear, but out of confidence. Each choice reinforced the same truth. I was capable. I always had been. There were days when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not for what I lost, but for what never existed in the way I needed it to. I mourned the fantasy of unconditional support, of a family that celebrated my presence instead of my utility. Allowing myself to feel that grief did not weaken me. It clarified me. It reminded me that wanting fairness was not selfish. It was human. One evening, my grandfather invited me to dinner. We ate quietly, talking about ordinary things, the kind of conversation that does not demand anything beyond attention. Afterward, as we sat on his porch watching dusk settle, he said he had seen families repeat the same patterns for generations, mistaking endurance for virtue. He said breaking those patterns always came at a cost, and that cost was often loneliness before it became freedom. I understood what he meant. There was a loneliness that followed my decision, a space where familiar chaos used to live. But that space had also given me room to breathe, to choose, to exist, without justification. I told him I was learning to trust that emptiness. He smiled and said that was how new foundations were built. By early summer, the storm had passed its most violent phase. What remained were adjustments, quieter and more permanent. My parents downsized their lives in ways they never thought they would have to. The image they had cultivated cracked, and without my constant reinforcement, it could not be fully repaired. People noticed. Some judged, some sympathized. None of it mattered the way it once had. The most significant change was internal. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. When someone asked why things had turned out the way they did, I answered simply or not at all. I trusted that my life did not require a defense. That trust was new, fragile at first, but it grew stronger with each boundary I kept intact. There came a moment when I realized I had stopped waiting for an apology. That expectation had dissolved quietly, replaced by acceptance. Apologies would not give me back the years I spent being smaller than I was. They would not teach my family what they had avoided learning. Closure, I discovered, was not something they could give me. It was something I claimed by moving forward without resentment. On a warm afternoon, as I packed away winter clothes, I found an old holiday card tucked into a drawer. My mother's handwriting covered the front. Words about gratitude and family written with sincerity I once believed without question. I held it for a moment, then set it aside. The memory no longer hurt the way it used to. It was simply a record of who we were then, not a mandate for who I had to remain. I stood in the center of my apartment and looked around, seeing not just furniture and walls, but a life shaped by deliberate choice. This space reflected me now, not the expectations placed on me. The quiet felt earned, not empty. The future felt open, not threatening. As the season shifted again, I understood something with complete clarity. Walking away had not destroyed my family. It had revealed it. And in that revelation, I had found myself. Whatever happened next would be built on truth instead of obligation, and that truth no longer scared me. The final chapter was waiting, not as an ending, but as a confirmation of everything I had learned. The last thing I expected after everything settled was how normal my days would become. Not better in some dramatic, movie-ending way, just normal. And that normal felt like a luxury I had never been allowed to afford before. I noticed it one morning while brushing my teeth. The mirror showed the same face, the same faint line between my brows, but my shoulders were relaxed. That line used to deepen whenever my phone buzzed, whenever I thought about money, holidays, or my parents' house. That morning, it didn't. I stood there longer than necessary, toothbrush idle, realizing my body had finally learned what my mind already knew. The emergency was over. The official confirmation arrived later that week, buried in a string of emails I almost deleted without reading. It was brief and cold in the way institutions always are. All matters finalized. No further obligations, no additional contact required. I stared at the words, waiting for the familiar spike of anxiety. It never came. Instead, I felt something close to disbelief. Not that it had worked, but that it had ended without me having to explain myself one last time. I closed my laptop and went outside. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and warm pavement. Neighbors passed me without a second glance. Somewhere down the block, someone was arguing loudly, and I smiled at the irony. For years, I thought my family's chaos was the center of the universe. Turns out it was just noise I had learned to prioritize. That afternoon, my mother tried to call. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was afraid, and not because I wanted to punish her. I simply didn't feel rushed anymore. I finished what I was doing, made myself a cup of tea, and then answered. Her voice was hesitant, stripped of the sharp certainty that used to command entire rooms. She said she heard things were finalized. She said the house would likely be sold. She said everything felt different now. I told her it was different. She asked how I was doing. The question landed oddly, like a foreign language she was trying to pronounce correctly. I could hear her bracing for an answer that required reassurance. I didn't give her one. I said I was doing well. There was silence on the line, thick and unfamiliar. In the past, that silence would have triggered me to fill it, to soften it, to take responsibility for her discomfort. This time, I let it stay exactly where it was. She said she wished she had handled things better. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't acknowledge what she had done. But she didn't attack me either. That was the closest we were going to get to honesty, and I accepted it without pushing for more. When we hung up, I didn't feel relieved or sad. I felt complete. That surprised me the most. A few days later, my father sent a short message. He said he hoped I was healthy. He said he missed talking to me. He didn't ask for anything. I replied politely and left it there. I was learning that distance didn't have to mean cruelty. It could mean clarity. Evan reached out too. His tone noticeably changed. Less defensive, less entitled. He told me he was handling things he never had to before. He said he didn't realize how much I had been doing behind the scenes. He didn't apologize outright, but there was humility in his words that had never been there. I thanked him for saying that, and wished him well. That was all. What struck me over the following weeks was how little energy I spent thinking about them. Not because I didn't care, but because my life was no longer arranged around their instability. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped flinching at notifications. I filled the space with things I had delayed for years. Small things at first. Rearranging my apartment. Signing up for a class I always told myself I didn't have time for. Taking a weekend trip alone without checking in with anyone. Each decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly surrendered over time. There were moments of grief. I won't pretend there weren't. Sometimes a memory would surface unexpectedly. A Christmas morning from childhood. A recipe my mother taught me. A family joke that used to make me laugh without effort. Those moments still carried warmth, but they no longer carried obligation. I allowed myself to miss what was good, without excusing what was harmful. That balance took time to learn. One evening, my grandfather came over for dinner. He watched me move around the kitchen with an ease I didn't used to have. After we ate, he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. He said, "You look like someone who finally stopped negotiating her worth." I laughed, but my throat tightened. He was right. For years, my value had been measured by what I could absorb. How much stress, How much responsibility? How much silence? The moment I stopped absorbing, the entire system panicked. And when the panic passed, what remained was truth. I didn't destroy my family. I exposed the imbalance that already existed. I didn't seek revenge. I chose boundaries. I didn't win a battle. I reclaimed my life. As the next holiday season approached, the familiar tension didn't return. There were no ultimatums, no dramatic announcements, just quiet distance and adjusted expectations. I spent that Christmas exactly how I wanted to: calm, warm, honest. And that was when I understood something deeply. The greatest consequence of my decision wasn't what happened to them, it was what stopped happening to me. No more anxiety disguised as loyalty. No more guilt disguised as love. No more responsibility without respect. If you're listening to this and you feel that same pressure, that sense that your role in your family is to fix, to pay, to smooth everything over, I want you to know this. You are not heartless for stepping back. You are not selfish for protecting yourself. And you are not wrong for refusing to be the solution to problems you didn't create. Sometimes the most powerful act of revenge isn't destruction, it's withdrawal. If this story resonated with you, stay with me. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been the one everyone relied on, and what happened when you finally stopped. And if you want more stories about family drama, betrayal, karma, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself, make sure you're subscribed. Because sometimes the happiest ending isn't reconciliation, it's freedom.